Good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to our Innovation Week session on designing better policy. So this is obviously the first day of Public Service Innovation Week 2020, and this is our third session and our final session for today. So my name is Pauline Mulligan, and my day job is Head of Corporate Services Division in the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation. But I am also sponsor of the innovation action under our public sector reform programme, our Public Service 2020. So this session is about designing better policy. But what do we mean when we say policy? So I want this session to take a broad definition of policy, because policy development doesn't stand alone unless it's relevant to the citizen. So I think we need to talk about implementing policy as well as designing policy. So we're essentially talking about public sector policy and delivery. It's about a whole continuum, policy formation right through to implementation and service delivery for the citizen. And that has changed in recent months as the pandemic has hit us. And I don't necessarily think that it's all been bad. I think there has been some positives. I think a crisis gives us a platform for change sometimes, to accelerate change that we have been trying to effect pre-COVID. So, for example, a policy objective of the government's was to have more companies trading online. And the crisis has given companies more of an impetus and a reason to trade online, as their front doors and their shop fronts have been temporarily disabled due to lockdowns. Digitisation of service has also been a policy priority. And now we're literally being forced, both public service and providers and the public, to digitise more of our services. Remote working also across the public service has changed significantly over the last 6 months, as we realise how much we can do remotely, offering better quality of life sometimes, less commute times, more time with our families, and less impact on the environment. So there are huge opportunities for us to accelerate progressive policies and implementation of services that support digital and the green agenda. But we can't do everything online, and there is still a digital divide, I think, when we consider broadband connectivity. So a key question for me is, how do we engage with the citizen using new forms of communication brought on by COVID, but also using more traditional methods of stakeholder engagement? So the question is, how do we do both, and what is the best blend to deliver the optimum policies and service delivery for our citizens? So that's what I want this session to be about this afternoon. And I'm delighted to be joined by two very esteemed colleagues who have done a lot of research in this area and have some great insights for us today. So my first panellist is Sabine Younganer, an internationally recognised expert in human-centred design, organisational change and management. And her research pursues emerging areas of theory and practice in design relating to organisation and management, including matters of design and policy making and policy implementation. She heads the Competence Centre for Design and Management at the Lucerne University of Applied Science and Arts in Switzerland. My second panellist is Madeleine Gabriel, and she is Head of Inclusive Innovation at Nesta UK. So Madeleine's work asks, who benefits innovation, who takes part in it, and how policies can be designed so that risks and rewards of innovation are more equally shared. She has researched inclusive approaches to innovation policy for the European Commission and a range of other international bodies. So just to outline how the session will proceed, so I'm going to just ask each of my panellists to do their presentation first, 10 to 15 minutes on this topic. And then I think they both have slides, Sabine and Madeleine. So then we'll have a little bit of a conversation about some of the themes emerging. And then you can get involved in the conversation as we go along as well by putting your questions into the chat function. And I will try to leave some time at the end to come to your questions. So without further ado, I will ask Sabine to deliver her presentation first. Thanks.
The picture that you see right now is a very personal picture. It's actually my great-grandmother, my brother, and my niece. And I'm bringing in people to the fore because these are three different people in very different life situations and in very, very different needs and wants, and policies matter for them, all of them, but in different ways, in different places, in different contexts. But at the end of design, whenever we design anything, it's about people. It's something we like to forget, or we often easily forget. Maybe we don't like to, but we easily forget that no matter what we do, when we put human thought and human action to the fore, and we create something that we are expecting other people to either use, comply with, or do something with, that all has in the end an impact on our daily life and on our ability to live a full and life within a community, within society, and of course also within the environmental context of it all. If we can go on for the next slide, I'll just briefly talk a little bit about how I got there and what we're doing right now at the Competence Center of Design and Management. We're taking this issue of designing, the idea that there are many designers in this world, many of them in the public sector. There are many design issues and challenges in the world, many and the most pertinent ones in the public sector. We are taking this to our work and in our projects, for example, as an official partner for the digital transformation of the community of Ammon, or when we collaborate with the EU commissioners and members of the European Parliament to explore how we can change or go about redesigning policies in the context of just recovery and a green recovery, for example. And we're also involved in the Creative Bureaucracy Festival Academy, where we continuously offer opportunities for interested people in the public sector, in the civil society and across there, to join us and to get familiar with these new ways of, or different ways of working and thinking and doing and going about policy making. Just the next two slides, maybe just very briefly. Slide number 3 shows you a little bit how long this story is of thinking about policy making and policy implementation, and how we have worked over the years to also alert people in policy schools to engage with these topics. For example, at the Hertie School of Governance, where I'm a fellow and where I've been introducing these kind of topics as early as 2010. And then we expanded and worked across the board with Nesta and with the OECD, and in my role as an advisory board member of MindLab, I was able to get yet another input and insight into the challenges of designing in this context. So if we go to slide 5, that's the diagram, thank you very much. Then I just want to take you on a bit of a journey of starting to talk about design in this public sector context, in this context of policy making and policy implementation, because we have, of course, many different ways already developed to address policy changes and policy methods and principles to arrive at policies that we hope are contributing to enhance the human living. But from a design perspective, we found out early on that this is very mechanistic, fragmented, looking to the past, and not really trying to or missing a lot of essential aspects that we find are the success factors in other design efforts, namely to include people in this whole design process. And so when we see this policy cycle led by Howlett and Ramesh, we see that somebody somewhere identifies a policy need, somebody else clarifies the policy need, somebody yet else formulates a policy, and then somebody else is responsible to actually implement that. And I know that this is still a common practice, and that I know that this Innovation Week is one of these efforts to change this. But before we really can change anything, we need to kind of like assess where we are. And this is part of what these kind of diagrams are doing to help us understand how we mentally have fragmented policy making from policy implementation. So we have basically hacked one design process that is clearly needed to develop a functioning product, namely the policy. And we have over the years actually divided it into different design activities and different design challenges that we need to now reconnect again. And that's exactly what this is all about, what we're doing these days, and what this conference is also about. If we go to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Yes, that's good. We are talking about bringing people together and reflecting on how this might happen. And so one of the things that I've done in my work is to bring these, to offer different places. I call them the archetypes of these kind of engagements with people, designing with people, designing by people, and designing for people. And for the public sector, I've developed this matrix where we can find many traditional approaches in the public sector in the left bottom corner, where we have a government agency, a government organization, policymakers, you name it. And they're very, very smart people, and they're very caring people. They're very knowledgeable people, yet the one thing they know little about is actually about the citizens they're designing for. That is, they think they know a lot about them, and they have a lot of assumptions and a lot of expectations, many of them driven by their own understanding of themselves. And we find more and more that that is not working. And so we're moving more to the right hand of this matrix, where we say, like, actually we need to include people early on in the policy making, and that means we have to develop new skills within the organizations. Like I just said, I'm working with the students at the Hattie School of Governance, because there is not traditionally a training for future policymakers, or even at the University for Public Administration Sciences in Germany, in Speyer, there aren't courses where future decision makers, future public managers, future policymakers would actually engage and learn about these kind of approaches. So by providing such diagrams, we can at least start a design conversation and say, like, okay, well, who is designing here? Who is included? Who are we not including and addressing here? For whom are we designing, and by whom are we designing? So this kind of diagram is known as a conversation starter about designing, where we can at least reflect on where we are right now and where we want to maybe go and be. If we can go to the next slide, please. So all this is about bringing together also not only people within government, which is already a major undertaking, but it's also an effort to bring people around this quadruple helix that the OECD so nicely explained on social innovation together. So policies are for the social context, and usually need to somehow support social innovation, especially nowadays when we have so many unforeseen challenges, and we're what is now addressed as a VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and where it's very unclear what we actually should make. We have and for whom and with whom and who needs to be that. And that's why we say, like, design is actually predestined to support policymaking here, because that is an art, a discipline that has always coped with the unknown and knows how to build the shelf, not just put in a new drawer, a new method into the existing shelf. We are rebuilding the structure, the shelf itself. Next slide, please. So this is already most evident with the digital world right now. We had just recently a digital public participation workshop with a number of government agents. And this picture is actually much older, but it still is the same issue. We have to bring these different people together. And this is a picture from Paris, actually, from I think 2015, where we worked with ministerial employees and staff on rethinking how they can actually engage with people. And we brought these groups together and we give them hands-on stuff to actually think and work slightly differently than what they have been using so far, what they usually would do in their office if they have a meeting and come together. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. Yes. And so there is this idea that when we talk about the policy cycle and policy making, we have to make people and services central from the start. And if you remember the matrix I just showed you, it depends on what stage in the process you are, what kind of policy intent there is to understand who these people are and what kind of services would need to be available for what other people, we don't know yet. And this is a continuous effort where people and services need to be central when we talk about a human-centered design approach to the aforementioned policy cycle. Next slide, please. And how that works in practice is, for example, in Brazil, where the Ministry of Planning, Budget and Development has made an effort to come together with these different innovators within government. They have developed ways to find them, and then also to, through interviews and through workshops, to develop a common vision, a common agenda, where that superior ministry actually can now find a new role to support them in many different ways than was possible and foreseen beforehand. Next slide, please. There is the EU Policy Lab that we have run recently in online for people to in the EU Commission and in the EU Parliament, where you can see the process of that day. It was a 3-hour policy lab to bring together people who know maybe each other, but often don't get a chance to work with each other, and to get them to work in a very different way, to get them to know each other in a very different way, and to arrive at the end with something that they have commonly created in that short amount of time, that is something that they can pursue as kind of like a task assignment, a work assignment for themselves over the next couple of months to develop this further, here in particular in regards to the COVID Recovery Fund. Next slide, please. And the community of Emmen, which has sought the conversation around the digital transformation, because they understand that they want to be out there and proactive and supportive of the new ways of working as a community. They want to sustain public value. They want to create new public value. And they're working with us in the Competence Center now to constantly exchange and inform, but also to start new skills, to start new opportunities, engage differently with students, make use of students in their work, but also of international exchanges, just to learn more about this kind of context. Next slide, please. And so bringing you back to that idea that you have service and people in the center, if that is pursued in the way that we're approaching it from human-centered design, you can start with the top, with policy intent, and make it a point that this is a time and place to discover ambiguities, and if done right, from policy intent to policy making, then leads to policy innovation. If you then go around the circle and you realize you need to come from policy making to policy implementation, again, service and people are in the center of all of these activities and doings, and we have to do with and cope with organization innovation and service innovation in that end. All this concerns inventing possibilities, again, a design activity. And if we can come full round, then we are at, if we consistently pursue and honestly engage in this, we express these new discoveries and new inventions in new values with new products and services. And that is when we can talk about arriving at social innovation. I thank you very much. This was very much the 15-minute input I would give for now, and I'm open to questions and comments later on. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Sabine. So I'll hand over to Madeleine. Some very interesting, particularly interesting, the matrix actually, where you talk about designing for, with, or co-creating with the citizen, and then the feedback loop you talk about in terms of the experience of implementation and feeding it back to the further evolution of policy development. But we'll come back to some of those. Maybe Madeleine, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pauline. It's great to be talking to everyone today, so thank you for inviting me. I'm Madeleine Gabriel. I work at Nesta in the UK. Just a little bit about us before I kick off. So we're an innovation foundation. We were set up about 20 years ago, initially part of government, an arm's length body, and we became an independent charity back in 2012. And our focus is really on social innovation. It's about working with governments at all levels of government to help them to innovate. We work across a range of different policy areas. Examples include education, health, work and skills, and science and innovation policy. So Sabine warned against splitting up the policy making and policy implementation sort of sides too much, and advise us to see that all that is one thing. I am actually going to talk mainly about the first bit, so involving the public in setting policy priorities and taking decisions. If you could just move on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. I think it might be fair to say citizen involvement in policymaking. Like I think over the last couple of years, everyone's talking in particular about citizens' assemblies. Now, of course, Ireland's been a real leader here. You've had the Constitutional Commission back in 2012, which was recommending, amongst other things, changes that allowed same-sex couples to marry. And we heard a lot in the UK about the Citizens' Assembly convened on the 8th Amendment just before the referendum in 2018. In the UK, we've had the Climate Assembly recently, which published its results last month. But citizens' assemblies are really being used around the world at the moment. There was a big process in Germany last year looking at democratic reform, for example. Citizens' assemblies are an example of what you might call deliberative public engagement. So the idea is that you're asking members of the public to help shape or take policy decisions through a process of deliberation where they're weighing up different options and then coming up with recommendations. Assemblies have really got a lot of attention recently, but they're not the only methodology out there. There's quite a lot of others, including things like citizens' juries, public dialogues, deliberative polling. I expect you'll all have heard of several of those types of methods. If we could just move on to the next slide. And to say a bit about, why have these methods come to such attention recently? What's the benefit of doing this, at least in theory? I'm going to credit the OECD here, who's published a really useful report this year looking at innovative citizen participation for democracy. And I really recommend it to you to have a look at if you haven't. And they talk about 7 reasons why you might want to involve the public. So I won't read them all out, but for example, they talk about better policy outcomes. If you're involving more people within a deliberative process, you can the idea is that you'll come to better results. So you want to inform policy making not only by expert knowledge, but by people's own experience and values and input from the broader community. I think a really important point is about legitimacy. So deliberative processes, like citizens' assemblies, have often been used when questions are quite controversial or value-laden, and decision makers have to make quite hard choices. And if you involve a representative selection of the public in doing that, you do tend to have greater legitimacy for those decisions. These types of methods can also enhance public trust. They signal civic respect, as it says here, so this idea that citizens' voices are valued. They can make governance more inclusive by opening the door to a more diverse group of people. They can try and make sure that decision-making processes aren't captured by particular interest groups, so they can strengthen the integrity of those processes and maybe prevent corruption. And they can also help counteract polarisation and disinformation, which of course is hugely important at the moment. If we could just move on to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about my experience. So my experience specifically is in research and innovation policy. This is what I've been working on over the last three years or so at Nesta. And my focus is on trying to make innovation policy more inclusive, both in terms of its processes and its outcomes. So I've been looking at how we might involve more people in innovation policy making and also ensure that innovation policies benefit more people. In 2018, we launched this programme which we called Everyone Makes Innovation Policy, and it was really trying to explore ways to do this. So how might we involve more people? And just briefly, this picture comes from a heat-seeking quest. This was a public engagement activity that we funded, run by a climate change charity called Possible. And they took people out with these thermal imaging cameras to help people sort of observe heat loss from buildings. And the idea was that it was going to build people's knowledge and kind of interest in things like heat loss, which would then galvanise them to act, to make their views heard to policymakers. If we could just move on to the next slide. I think, can we move on? Yes, this one, thanks. I think science and research and innovation is a really interesting policy area when it comes to public engagement. Because for one hand, there's actually been a recognition for quite a long time that you do need to involve the public in this area. Often it comes from a place of wanting to avoid some backlash. If I had £1 for every time I've heard a policymaker say something like, we want to avoid another GM debacle, I'd have a few pounds by now. So it's really prompted government to think about how they might invest in public engagement in science. And in the UK, we've had a programme running for the last few years called ScienceWise, which does that. And these dialogues that ScienceWise runs have really showed that the public do think quite differently about science and technology compared with policymakers. So I've got some quotes here on the left and quotes here on the right from those two different groups. Those in government on the right here are likely to think about science mainly as things like a driver of the economy, a driver of competitiveness. They think of it as something that can solve social problems and deliver social goods. And they tend to see social and ethical issues as separate from the technologies themselves. These quotes come from a paper by an academic called Melanie Smallman, who's at University College London, who's looked at these issues in quite a lot of depth. And she quotes one advisor as saying something like, the civil servant, as saying, you could argue that a lot of the anti-GM lobby is much more about mechanisation and over-technologicalisation of agriculture and capitalism and the food chain, and lots of things that have absolutely nothing to do with GM and the science. So they kind of see those issues as completely separate from research and innovation and science. But members of the public see this quite differently. So they don't see the future of agriculture as nothing to do with the science. They see it as really interwoven. For public, the risks and benefits are often integral to science and innovation and not something that can be resolved away. So instead, you have to weigh up the risks and rewards and make good decisions based on those. And I think these quotes and this kind of idea that the public sees science and technology differently from government, on the one hand, it shows the need and value for public involvement, because otherwise, actually those views can be quite out of step with each other. But on the other hand, it does cause some problems and we often hear how difficult it is for civil servants to take on the results of public dialogues in this area and use them, because the findings are often quite contingent. The finding is normally, is gene editing a good thing? The findings will normally be, well, it depends. And it's actually quite hard for people to use that. And Melanie Smallman says that the reason that's hard to use is because the machinery of government isn't set up well to respond to public views. So I thought it would be interesting just to reflect quickly on a couple of examples where decision-making processes have been designed specifically so they can take on public views. If we could just go on to the next slide. You might have heard of this. I'm not going to try and say what this says, but translated into English, this is the Dutch National Research Agenda. In 2014, the Dutch government announced it would create a new national research agenda and that it was going to be co-created with the public. So starting in the next year, the residents of the Netherlands were asked to ask a scientist a question through the National Research Agenda website. And they actually got nearly 12,000 questions submitted, which is way more than the government were expecting. They then involved experts in the process. So they got 70 researchers to assess these questions and group them into clusters, and then got the wider research community to discuss them at conferences. And eventually the clusters were honed down to 140 headline questions arranged in 5 themes. And then they got the public back involved. So they ran some events where people who'd submitted questions could talk to researchers about them and so on. Now, it was really interesting, this. So those 140 questions became the Dutch research agenda, and research funding was funneled a lot according to those headline questions. And it was quite hotly debated amongst researchers, because if there's one thing that academics don't tend to like, it's other people making decision on how research funding is used. And there's a really great open access book that, if anyone's really interested in this, you can read, which has reflections, some criticisms, some lessons from the process. But one of the things I think that I found particularly interesting was that the public themselves were interested in a very wide range of topics. You might expect that people who aren't science experts really want to see applied science, so things like how might you cure cancer and so on. But actually, members of the public, they were interested in those types of questions, but they were also interested in much more philosophical questions, things that require basic research. Those questions right from things like, can we develop an MRI scanner that makes less noise, through to things like, why are nations still at war with each other? So it was a really interesting process in kind of confounding expectations of what the public actually wants. And also, it forced researchers to work together across disciplines. So it almost definitely gave a different type of research agenda that would have been designed without public involvement. If we could just go on to the next slide. Could we go on to that? Thank you. This is a completely different example. You might have heard of this, VTai1. It's a hybrid online and offline consultation process that the Taiwanese government uses, and it was set up by the digital minister there called Audrey Tang, who's an ex-hacker and an activist. Basically, VTai1 uses a process to deliberate around contentious issues. It has several stages. It starts with an objective stage, which crowdsources facts and evidence. Then it moves on to a reflective stage, as they call it, where they're looking at using mass deliberation tools, online tools that use a tool called Polis quite a lot, which encourages people to form consensus. And this diagram is actually an output of Polis. It shows how different groups of views can be clustered together. And then they have an interpretive stage where they have public meetings to interpret the evidence. And finally, a decision-making stage where they draft proposals and then send them to the relevant policymakers. And I got interested in this because it's been used, one of the ways it's been used is to involve members of the public in issues around regulation of technology, which is often thought of as an area where you can only involve experts. It's normally seen as something really kind of niche and not something that the public can get involved in. But in Taiwan, they've used it to regulate Uber, which arrived in 2015. It was very popular, but also very controversial. And the process came up with, quite a lot of, consensus, actually, even between stakeholder groups with really different interests. And they managed to create a set of proposals which were almost all accepted by the government. So they included things like taxis not needing to be painted yellow, app-based fleets not being allowed to pick up members of the public randomly from the street, making sure that app-based taxis can't charge less than standard taxi fare, and so on. So it's a really interesting example. However, these last two examples I've shown you are pretty large scale. They're long-term processes. There's a lot of money being invested in them. So I just wanted to quickly reflect on whether you can do things at a slightly smaller scale. If you could just move on to the next slide. I'm involved in an EU project called Pro Ethics. And one of the things it's doing is getting research and innovation funding agencies across Europe to pilot different ways of extending participation in their decision-making processes. So this diagram, this little graphic, comes from Innovaris, which is a research funder in the Brussels capital region in Belgium. It's got a programme called Co-Create, which funds innovation for urban resilience, and it's just started involving citizens in the decision-making panels for its grant applications. So it's really quite small scale. Those 2 jury panels that it's run with citizens have included just two citizens on each panel with some experts, over the process, they've learned a lot about what it means, how you can involve citizens effectively in those types of discussions, and they're looking to extend them. Can we just move on to the next slide? This is the last example I'm going to give, but I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the question of bottom-up versus top-down. So a lot of the examples I've given, all the examples I've given so far, start from government. So government's having a question which they want to get public input on. And those examples have been creative about how they get the input and how much of the decision-making they pass on to the members of the public themselves. But obviously, in that case, the government is still setting the terms of the discussion. So we've been asking what happens if you switch that around and try and support communities to come up with priorities themselves. We've been working with Citizens UK, which is a community organising network in the UK, to try and create pressure for change from the bottom up. So we've got 2 projects running, one in London, one in Birmingham, and they're using community organising to come up with community-led charters relating to innovation. So communities are developing one on digitalisation and one on business support for ethnic minority-led businesses. And I find this really interesting because, going back to a point I made earlier, it focuses on both the process and the outcomes of innovation. So the charters are trying to make innovation deliver better outcomes for communities. But the process is really important. The key point of community organising is that it tries to empower members of the community to play a more active role in public life. So they take part in this charter development, but then they're also in a better position to advocate for their needs and for the people they represent in future. And one final thought on this, because I've not mentioned the pandemic, but community organising is normally a very face-to-face method. It relies a huge amount on relationship building. But over the pandemic, they've really been innovating. So this picture comes from a Zoom assembly, getting people together to kind of come up with ideas and deliberate over Zoom. And actually, the people I've been talking to at Citizens UK, they found this quite challenging because they're so used to working face to face. They also realise there's some benefits, so they've got people involved who wouldn't otherwise taken part. So if you could just go on to the next slide. This really just sums some things up. How can you do this? 7 principles for public engagement in policy making. I won't go through all of them in detail. I think the first one is probably the most important. If you really want public engagement to work, or you want to be able to really create a space for the public to shape policy, the process has to be supported by people with the power to change things. Otherwise, it's just talking. And there's lots of ways, of course, that you can do that. And I guess I'll just pick up the third one as well. It's really about design, and perhaps that reflects what Sabine was saying. It matters how well you design these processes. They don't have to be huge and expensive and long term, but they do have to be carefully thought through. So if we could go to the next slide. This is my final one. If you had to take one message away from this, I would just say, if you want public sector innovation to benefit more people and you want to avoid costly mistakes, it's important to involve a much wider range of people in setting priorities and taking decisions. And I look forward to discussing this a bit more with Sabine and with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, and some very interesting perspectives there, I think. And a lot of what you've been speaking about, and Sabine too, I guess, touch on this idea of, the mechanisms and the methodologies and the kind of structures that we have in place or don't have in place to engage with citizens. And you mentioned the citizens' assemblies. I guess that's a very formulaic kind of structured, large-scale engagement with citizens. But I guess I'm thinking of all those public sector workers that are sitting listening to us today and maybe thinking about their own policy area or their own area of service delivery. And I guess to be a slightly devil's advocate to your very interesting presentations, I suppose my question to both of you, Sabine and Madeleine, would be, is it realistic, particularly when you think of, the urgency around which people have to develop and deliver new policies and new ways of implementing for the public? Is it realistic or is it idealistic to think that we would have time, apart from money and resources, but the time itself, to develop this more inclusive and human-centred approach to our work? Like, is it really a lot of theory, or is it really is it practical to think that public servants can take on these recommendations that you have, and I know there's some excellent theoretical material here, but how does that work in practice? And I guess, what are the benefits then to policymakers and to the users? So maybe, Sabine, could I ask you to come in first on those two questions?
Absolutely, thank you very much, and a very important, relevant and pertinent question. Now, the interesting thing is that when we talk about time, we do know that the current processes and the current approaches take way too long to get anywhere. And we are in a time where we need to be more, as like the agile as the keyword, be agile, be dynamic, be quick, be fast. And these different approaches to designing or to approaching design problems and challenges in the public sector actually offer speedier approaches. Now, what does it take for that? It usually takes, at this stage, for most people, not for everyone, but for most people, it takes a little bit of help from someone who actually knows how to structure such a research. But the research and the work itself has to be done by those in decision-making and policy-making capacities, because you are the experts, and all we can do is help you go about it differently and help you, develop these kind of capabilities and skills internally, so that in the end, you don't need external help anymore, I would say. And we see that already in the Irish government with this Innovation Week. I'm super impressed with this team of 6 people internally that is looking to approach these problems differently. Now, I give you a verbatim example from Brazil, where under the most severe circumstances, when Dilma Rousseff was basically impeached, and the members, the public managers, every tier in public government had no idea what tomorrow would bring, literally no idea. And yet what they did know was that the problems that they were facing today, they would still be there tomorrow, and they would probably be even more crass and more severe, because the resources would be gone, the budgets would be cut even more, and that the only way forward was to actually develop new ways of addressing these problems. So the cost issue is another way to ask, like, what's the cost of not doing it? And what will we lose then?
Madeleine?
Yeah, I'd echo those things. I mean, I think that it doesn't have to be really expensive in terms of time or other costs. And the example I've given of this pro-ethics project tries to illustrate that. I mean, it's running with these research and innovation agencies, most of which have not really done any public involvement before, and they're piloting these new methods, mainly at fairly small scale, just to learn how to do it and to build up those relationships, I suppose, and the muscles and the capabilities, if you like, to involve members of the public. I have had people come to me saying, we need to produce a new strategy for government on X, Y, or Z. In the next 3 weeks, what's the best way to engage the public? And in those cases, I'd probably say, well, don't, because it won't be a real process. You won't really be able to use those findings. But Sabine says most of the problems are long term. They're not something you necessarily have to come up with a final answer for next week, even if you do have to put a submission to a spending review or whatever. So I think it's more about trying to put in place processes that can allow for people to get involved, and building up that type of capability in relationships.
Okay, thanks. My other question was, where is the best place to start if you were advising somebody, like where to start? And I think you kind of touched on that, Sabine, when you said get somebody to help you, like get somebody who has some expertise in this area and doing this, engaging with the public. I like that idea of, what is the cost of not doing it? And we should be looking at that as well. So Sabine, did you want to come back in again there?
Yeah, because for me also, we're talking a lot about including citizens, and that is absolutely a cornerstone of this approach, also human-centered design. But we should not forget that there's a little bit of a tendency also in design in general to design for the end user, i.e. here in the public sector, we think of the citizen or the member of the public. We do need to understand that there is also all these people in the government that also need to learn how to do this, need to be given opportunities how to do, who want to do that. There are many who are doing it already, and their impact could be much greater if we provided them with either the legitimacy or the authority to actually unfold their capacity and their capabilities and potential in this context. I just want to make sure that when we talk about this inclusiveness, you know, when we talk about working with people, also with the matrix, a lot of that has to do that we ourselves, and that, you know, when you ask where do we start, actually it's looking in the mirror and saying, like, how do we work? How is it that our products and services and our policies actually currently achieve what we want them to achieve? Where are they failing us? And then when we understand what's not working, or when we understand that it is not working, then how can we then look at the process and the approach that we chose? What kind of design principle were we pursuing? What kind of design methods were we actually employing? Which ones didn't we use? And what kind of practices are we actually here enacting in our environment? And to just even understand the box in which we are currently in, and to understand where there are maybe opportunities to do it then differently and experiment in a different way.
Okay, thanks for that. And I think, you know, what you touch on there a little bit as well is about skills and capabilities within the public sector to actually do this and engage with people. And so we need to consider that and do it in a structured way in terms of helping people on that journey. And just on that point, Sabine, that you mentioned there about when and how far back do we go? So that is another interesting question. I mean, often when we consult stakeholders, we feel we have to bring something to the table. So we've already identified the problem and we're coming with the solution. And we're doing that in all honesty, thinking it's a good way to engage, because it's difficult just to have a completely open conversation with citizens or stakeholders with no direction or no structure in terms of where you intend to go. So we feel like we have to bring a solution almost and ask them about the solution. Whereas I think often maybe it's the case that we need to be engaging stakeholders earlier in the process in terms of identifying a shared description of the problem. What is the problem we're trying to solve? And should we be engaging earlier in the process with stakeholders and with citizens in identifying the problem? Madeleine,
I want to
do you
give a
want to come in on
chance.
that?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, thanks. I really agree with that. I think one thing I love about the V-Taiwan example that I mentioned is that their consultations start with these open questions framed around the idea of how may we. So how may we do something? How may we regulate Uber so that it delivers good outcomes for citizens and for existing stakeholder groups? And that means that, okay, the problem is somewhat defined early on, but the solution isn't, and they're really quite open to it. The science-wise dialogues I mentioned are an example of trying to engage really upstream, so getting an idea of public values around emerging technologies. And that's another good example. It does take some investment, but you were asking about cost earlier, Pauline, and science-wise, I think has had a budget of sort of between £2.5 and £3 million a year, so it is quite a significant budget. But on the other hand, the UK has been spending something like £9 billion a year on research and innovation. So when you compare it with the cost of what we actually invest, it's not all that much money. So yeah, I think there's a real place for engaging quite upstream, both in thinking about what is the problem we're actually trying to solve, and also being quite open about what the solutions might be that come forward.
Can I just add to Pauline's observation? Because, it's also a bit of a problem that many people in the public sector are misunderstanding the concept of being professional. So many times there is a sense that they have to deliver something or provide something to their colleagues and to people that they have already produced in order to maintain their professional face and their professional status and show that they are competent. And that is something that we have to start addressing, that it's okay, as one of my participants years ago said from a public organization, you don't like to show people your house when it's not clean, you know, when it's not in order. And this idea of showing somebody else your house when it's not yet in order, it's exactly at that point when you want people to come in, because that's the people you want to feel comfortable in your house. So you want them to help you rebuild it and reshape it. And there is a bit of I just wanted to add that, because that is a problem. And that's why I say, you know, we often have to look in the mirror first and say, like, what are our understandings and notions of going about being professional, for example, here.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to go to questions in 1 minute, but I just wanted to ask you before I do that, just in terms of what does success look like, and what are the key metrics, I guess, that we would use to figure out if we have been successful, been inclusive enough, engaged sufficiently with the end user. So what does success look like, and how do we measure it? Madeleine, do you want to come in first on that?
Yeah, should I go first on that? I think success incorporates a bit around the process and a bit around the outcomes. So first on the process, the process needs to be well designed, and people need to feel that it was worthwhile. It's really important that people who are involved get something out of it. And so quite a lot of these types of processes, when they evaluate, they look at what people felt about taking part and whether they think they were listened to and so on. And you can also think about, you know, who did you manage to reach, and to what extent was that representative of the wider population and so on. In terms of the outcomes, what you want to see is that, that the process generates good inputs to a policy process. I guess that's a bit subjective in terms of what's good, but something that could be used. And then obviously you want to look at the influence. So, you know, were processes able to influence decision making in any way, and what wider impact might they have had? So did they shape, say, the way that policymakers are thinking or acting, or the wider public thinks about a particular issue? And just because that's quite theoretical, so just to give an example, we ran a public dialogue on the use of AI in health, and invited some decision makers along who were working on issues around regulating artificial intelligence. And we had them as kind of participants in the process. So they weren't just observing, but they weren't in the same groups as citizens, because that might have made people feel uncomfortable. So we actually got them doing the same exercises, but as a group with each other, and they could hear a lot about what citizens were saying about the same issues. And for them, we got some great responses, great feedback just on, how they hadn't heard people make these types of comments before, or they were really surprised in some cases that actually citizens were discussing things in the same sort of terms that they did. They were actually, as people who were concerned about AI and privacy and all of these types of things in their daily jobs, they were surprised in some cases how members of the public were much sort of less concerned about some of those issues than they were. So I think that, as a whole, kind of says, well, we don't necessarily expect everything that comes out of consultation or dialogue or citizens' assemblies or whatever to be taken on in exactly those, take on the recommendations exactly as citizens made them. That'd be an unrealistic expectation. But you do want to see some results, some influence, some change as a result of the process.
So can I add to that? Yes, thank you. I agree with everything Madeleine has said, and I'm also prone, like Madeleine, the first result and success is not on an individual personal level. It's a much larger scope of increasing trust and confidence in government, and that's something that we badly need as a larger issue. And then other ways to measure success are much more project related. And it's indeed one of the challenges of each effort and undertaking to define their own criteria for success. Because if they're starting out for something new and innovative, there is not an existing criteria that they can just fulfill. They have to develop it, and they have to then come to terms with that in this particular project that they're working on. But of course, there are other considerations. I'm thinking structural. Like, for example, in Brazil, where you have now a department for digital user experience in the Ministry of Economics. And that is a department where all the other ministries and government agencies, when they develop digital interaction platforms for citizens and the public, that they actually have to go back to that department, and that department has a very good user research capability and understanding of human-centered design. So they actually go out and do some real engagement with citizens to see, like, well, does that even make sense, and is that, does it work? And they come back with suggestions for that particular other group, the department that has devised their solution, with actual feedback. So it can also be a structural element in government to which I would consider a success in making it more sustainable and integrated into the overall approach and process. And of course, the other cost is also economic. And I mentioned that in our pre-talks, you can always measure cost, even if you don't have the exact numbers. You can, like in Brazil, for example, very much understand that there is cost when people waste hours and hours waiting in line to go to an office, or driving somewhere and then trying to get something done, when actually a well-designed internet or online service can help them do that in 20 minutes. There's cost attached to driving there, waiting there, not working on your actual work, and so on and so on. So we have to maybe also start talking, we also have to start to talk in different terms of cost and broaden our understanding what that actually means.
Okay, thank you both for that. I know we're close to the end of our time now. I did have one thing I wanted to ask both Sabine and Madeleine before we finish, and that was really to think about what would your top 3 practical tips you would give to, I guess, our audience listening. What are the 3 most important things you think they should do or be thinking about if they're starting a process and they want to engage with stakeholders or engage with end users, to be inclusive, to get it right? What are the top 3 things you would say to focus on now? Sabine, do you want
to
go first?
Yes, I'm happy to. My first recommendation is always to sit down and really have an honest conversation, and then say, like, who are the people we never talk to? Never. And these are people who may be going to restaurants and bars and places where, we actually shy away from, where it's not common, where we mingle. And how could we actually, start a conversation with someone like that? Because also in the digital public participation issues, we do understand that, of course, there is a certain self-selection of people who already know where to ask, how to ask, maybe even what to ask. But there are so many people out there who do not know what's going on. So I always say, go in a mall, go in a regular place, and one where you usually do not go to. So kind of like take yourself a little bit out of the comfort zone, and try to strike a conversation with a person about something that is related to what you're actually trying to do. People try to get into these kind of conversations. That's one thing I would do, just as an action, and also as a skilling, because that helps you learn how to actually engage with people. The other thing is, I would definitely say, try to, within your own team that you're working on and with, try to map out how you actually go about designing at this stage. How do you start? What gets you started? Where are your considerations? And kind of like map this and draw this. And then maybe say, like, well, but what is it that we're not doing? Or, compare that with, let's say, something you can find online with a design approach, and say, what are we not doing? So that's another way. go about it. And the other one is to say, like, okay, what is our biggest failure, or what is it, when the most recent thing that we're working on and it's just not working? Can we take that as a real example and say, like, why is this not working? And maybe we can get other people who we're not usually inviting into the conversation and into the design to come on board and say, like, okay, this is what we're trying to do. This is what's been happening. How what's your thought and side and view on that? So just to even broaden out and open up and take maybe small steps, but they already generate insights, and usually they provide some encouragement and good feedback.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's very boring when panelists all agree, but I think starting small is really important. So like thinking about, okay, what might be an opportunity just to broaden out the range of people that we speak to, and how could we involve them in something that we don't normally involve them in? I like the idea of going out and talking to people. Obviously, it's a bit harder with the pandemic, but I remember with a process we went through at Nesta last year when we were thinking about our strategy. We had some colleagues who work on design, and they encouraged some of us to just go out in the street and talk to random people we didn't know about their thoughts on career development. And it's scary, but it's so interesting. And I wouldn't necessarily use those findings to influence exactly the way I develop my policy ideas, because it's just a few anecdotes from individuals, but it can really spark different ways of thinking, and also just get you over that hump that talking to the public's really scary. And the last thing I'd mention is that there's so many people who've done an awful lot of work on this, and there's great resources out there to get you started. I recommended the OECD's work on deliberative public involvement, but I'd also recommend Involve as an organisation in the UK that's done loads of great work on this area, and their website's full of resources. Talked about all sorts of different participation methods, when you can use them, loads of considerations on how to do things well. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of experience that you could build on.
Thanks very much for that, Madeleine. Anything specific, Breda, or will we close the session? I'm conscious we're at 10 to 5, so we've come to the end of the session, I think, anyway, so I might just do some closing remarks, and really it's just to thank you all, and we could talk for hours on this topic. I think there's a lot of, even in those last comments that you've made, Sabine and Madeleine, that I would have further questions, and it would be lovely to have another conversation, so maybe we can do that another day. But thank you, a big thank you to you both. I've personally enjoyed the session and learned a lot from our discussions, so thank you both. Thank you to the audience for tuning in and for your comments and questions, which we'll also be reflecting back on. I would still encourage, there is still capacity available at other sessions throughout the week, so please do check it out on OPS website and log in for further sessions if you can make the time this week. This session brings to a close day one of Innovation Week. Thank you to you all again. Enjoy the rest of your week, whether that's joining in sessions here or else in your own organisation, celebrating and marking Innovation Week in the public service. So thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you, Breda. That was really a very, very charming.